Handout? Anybody doesn't have one? There's a couple over here. We're looking at classic texts on biblical holiness. And today we're looking at Philippians 3:2 to 4:1. Some of you may have gotten Philippians yesterday, and I hope you brought it with you if you did. We've got extra copies of yesterday if you didn't get yesterday. So they're here on the front bench. Philippians is one of the so-called prison epistles. There are four of them: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Now you notice that Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians are together, but Philemon is over there after Titus. What's going on? The letters of Paul are grouped in two groups. First of all is letters to churches, and then letters to individuals. And each of those two groups is organized by length. Not time, not subject, not addressee, length. So of the letters to churches, Romans is the longest, and actually 2 Thessalonians is a little longer than 1 Thessalonians, but the two of them are put together. So it's from longest to shortest of the letters to the churches, and then the same thing is followed. It's longest to shortest from 1 Timothy to Philemon. So that's the principle on which Paul's letters are organized. The principle, first of all, of group or person, and then length. So that's why Philemon, though it was written probably at the same time as Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, is not together with them. They were written probably, we don't know for certain, we know that Paul is in prison when he's writing these four letters. They were almost certainly written between 59 and 62. 1 Thessalonians was probably written in 49 or 50. Galatians was also written in 49 or 50. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans were written 55 to 57. And now here's this group, probably from Rome, although some people believe it might have been from Caesarea. Remember, he spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea before he finally appealed as a Roman citizen to have his case heard by the Caesar. So we don't know for certain, but probably all four of these books were written in Rome between 59 and 62. The first three, that is Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, are all doctrinal. As I said yesterday, those first two letters, Galatians and 1 and 2 Thessalonians, are dealing with the issue of sanctification. How do we go on now that we've been converted? And Paul says you go on in the Spirit. That's how you go on. You go on by faith. You go on believing that the Holy Spirit can fill you, can purify your heart, make your heart one. That's what purity of heart is. And can enable you to love, to be sexually pure, and so forth, as we talked about yesterday. 1 and 2 Corinthians are, of course, dealing with church problems, church discipline. Romans is the classic theological treatise looking at the whole picture. But now it appears that by 60, 62, Christ has become the issue. Who is Jesus Christ? What is his relationship to God? Is he just a human mediator? Is he just a human teacher? Is he actually God, and that Old Testament God we got to get rid of? A lot of questions emerging about the identity and the nature of Christ. And in these three letters, Paul settles that question forever. In Ephesians 1:1 to 14, Take your pencil sometime and underline "in Him." Think you'll discover that "in Him" occurs 9 or 10 times in those 14 verses. In Him, in Him, in Him. You're complete in Him. You're saved in Him. You are blessed in Him. You are raised in Him. Christ is the center of our faith, but that's because of His God and Father. In Colossians, the first chapter, verses 13 to 23, Paul insists that Jesus Christ is incomparable. There is nobody like Jesus Christ. He's settling that question. And in Philippians, he is continuing that discussion of the nature of Christ and His significance for us. Philippians 1 to 26 is the introduction. It's a very typical introduction in Paul's letters. You begin with a greeting, grace and peace. And some of you from earlier years of my teaching may know that I could spend a whole hour on grace and peace, but I don't have time to do that today. But that's where he begins, grace and peace. Then, typically, he moves into a prayer. He prays for these people he's writing to, and he tells them he prays for them constantly. And each of these prayers in Paul's letters is a precious, precious thing as you look at what it is in each case that he's asking for these people. It's distinctive. Each prayer is distinctive. He doesn't have a formal prayer for the whole bunch. He knows each group, and he's praying for them distinctively. And then the third element in that introduction is information about himself. How are you doing, Paul? My goodness. God's reward for 25 years of faithful ministry is jail. You think you got things tough? Remember Paul. And Paul is as happy as a canary in a cage. This book, and in fact all of the prison epistles, just overflow with joy. Joy. I found what I'm looking for. I'm looking for Jesus. They can't take Jesus away from me. They shut me in a cage. They shut Jesus in here with me. What more can I ask? And so Paul tells them, it's well with my soul. Not so good with my body. I may die. But he concludes saying, I don't think I'm going to die. I believe that it's useful for me yet to remain and to serve you and the other churches. And so he says, I believe that I'm going to be delivered from this imprisonment and I'm going to come and see you. That's the conclusion of the introduction, and it leads straight into the body of the book. 127 to 4:1. There's an error there in your handout, not 4:2, but 4:1. He says, when I come to see you, as I believe I'm going to do, there's something I long for. And if you look there in chapter 1, verse 27 and 28, you see, he says, when I come, let your conduct be worthy of the gospel. And that's the title that I would give to part A of this body. 127 to 230. Conduct that is worthy of the gospel. He says that conduct is going to be a single-mindedness. You're going to have one attitude. All of you together. You're going to have one mind. Not one brain. Not necessarily one way of understanding things. But you're going to have one attitude. And the attitude is the attitude of the Greek soldier. He uses a figure of speech here. The Greeks revolutionized warfare with the use of the phalanx. 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 Up to this time, first chariots and then cavalry had been the dominant weapon in the armies of the ancient world. The cavalry could sweep through on their powerful horses and just devastate the infantry, with every man taking off for himself. The Greeks, though, came up with the idea of an absolutely disciplined infantry. They had big shields, almost full-length shields, and they were drilled and drilled and drilled so that they could wheel as a line, they could form a box, they could retreat as a line. They were absolutely disciplined, every man knowing that his buddies were not going to break in the face of the charge. And so the Persian cavalry, greatest cavalry in the world, would come sweeping at this line, and it would sort of open up, and the cavalry would go in, and then the line would close behind them. And after a while, a few riderless horses would come straggling out. Paul is saying, oh, I long to see you, my brothers and sisters, with a mind like that, where every one of you is standing fast in one spirit, with one attitude, striving together for the faith of the gospel, not in any way terrified of your adversities. If the devil can separate us into single units, he can destroy us. But if I know that you're not going to break in the face of the charge, and if you know that I'm not going to break in the face of the charge, if you know you can hang your life on me, if I know I can hang my life on you, nothing can defeat us. Paul says, I long to see you with that kind of a mind. That's 127 to 2:4. All of you with one mind, and that mind is, I care about you more than I care about myself. Notice that that's where he closes 2:4. And most of us have heard Dr. Kinlaw point out that the typical English translation, right back to the King James, is not actually right. Let each of you look not to his own interests, but to the interests of others, is actually what the Greek text says. We just couldn't believe they were that cold-hearted. So we had to say, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interest of others. That's not what Paul says. Don't look to your own interests. Look to the interests of others. That, he says, is the mind. That's the attitude that will enable you to stand in the face of the enemy's charges and not be destroyed by them. And Paul says there in the early verses of chapter 2 that there are resources to enable us to do that. Consolation, encouragement, fellowship, affection, mercy. Christ, the Spirit, the Father are going to provide these things. Then he gives us in 2:5 to 11 the greatest example of what he's talking about. Someone who, in fact, forgets his own interests for the sake of the interests of others. And that, of course, is Jesus. The famous passage where Paul says, what attitude am I encouraging you to have? What mind am I encouraging you to have? I'm encouraging you to have the mind, the attitude of Jesus. Jesus, who could have demanded his right to remain in the courts of heaven, but instead chose a descending staircase. And have you noticed it? Servant, human, dead, the cross. Most humiliating, agonizing form of death that the world knew at that point. From God to a servant, to a human, to human death, to horrible, horrible death. Down the staircase he came. But praise his name because of that. Because of that, and for no other reason. If Jesus had refused to step down that staircase, I suppose the universe would have blown to pieces. But he didn't refuse, and because of that, he is highly exalted, given a name that is above every name, and all the world will bow down. What's the way to glory? The way to glory is the way of humiliation. Say that to the world, and the world says, what? No. The way to glory is scrabbling up the mountain of achievement. And if you have to walk on other people to do it, fine. That's the way to glory. You read books about achievement, and I guarantee you humiliation is not going to be one of their prescriptions. My ways are not your ways, says God. Now we could talk a long time about that again, and we don't have time to do that. Then, in 12 through 18 of chapter 2, Paul talks about working out this attitude. Paul is a practical person. Paul doesn't suggest, now please understand me here, I'm talking in hyperbole, I'm talking in great broad sweeps. But hear me, Paul doesn't say, now you just come to an altar and get the mind of Christ and that'll be that. You'll get a quick fix and there'll be no more problems. Paul does not suggest that. That's not to say that Paul wouldn't say, come to an altar and by faith receive the mind of Christ. But then he would say, now you've got to work that out. Now you've got to live that out. And in verses 12 through 18, he talks about how you do that. Number 1, verse 14, stop complaining. If you're going to have the mind of Christ, the first thing you got to do is quit complaining. Quit grumbling. And he says that above everything else will enable you to be blameless and harmless. And I'm going to say something about that in a few minutes. Brother Al mentioned the other night the absolute necessity of cultivating a spirit of thankfulness. If you're going to have the mind of Christ, you cannot allow yourself to be ruled by complaining and grumbling. Complaining and grumbling always focuses the attention on me. Poor me. Why do they treat me that way? Why do I always end up at the bottom of the heap? Why in the world doesn't my life turn out? And it'll eat you alive. Oh, Lord, thank you. Thank you for all the blessings I have. Thank you for all the goodness and the kindness that you have showered on me. Work it out, he says. And so then, he brings us finally in chapter 2 to 2 human examples. Now, Christ is a human example. Let's say 2 other human examples of this mind of Christ. First of all, Timothy forgets himself to take care of you. And then in verse 25 and following, Epaphroditus, the messenger who brought their love gift to him and then became sick while he was remaining caring for Paul. Paul says, you want to see what Christ-mindedness looks like? You want to see what two guys who forget themselves in their loyalty to those at their shoulders look like? Here they are, Timothy and Epaphroditus. Now it looks like he's ready to close his book at that point. Like a lot of preachers, he says finally, and then goes on for another half hour. Chapter 3, verse 1. Finally, my brethren, you know, what's the last thing I want to say to you in my letter? I want to say rejoice in the Lord. For me to write the same things to you is not hard, and it's safe for you. Why should you rejoice? Because it's the only safe way to live. And then he says, oh, by the way. And that introduces us then into the second part of the body of the book. I want to look at this now, of course, in the rest of our time in a lot of detail, but let's just map it out. It basically has two parts. Excuse me. No, I think I forgot to write down everything. The first part is confidence in the flesh. 3:2 through 6. The second part is 3:7 to 11. Knowing Christ. Third part is 3:12 to 16. Being perfect. And then the final is 3:17 to 22. Living for God, not the belly. All right, let's back up and look at this now in more detail. We're at number 5 on the handout. Paul says in verses 2 through 6, we've got to decide if we're going to have this mind of Christ, if we're going to be able to live in self-forgetfulness, if we're going to be able to live for others, we've got to decide where is our confidence. And if you'll notice, in verses 3 and 4, 3 times he says, confidence in the flesh. Now, translators struggle with that word flesh. We talked about it in some length last year in Romans, but let me just remind you. The Bible uses the word, the New Testament in particular, uses the word flesh in several ways. One is the body, and that's good. Jesus came in the flesh, and Paul just loves to say that. Because there were a lot of people, obviously, who were beginning to say, oh no, a good God couldn't live in this lousy stuff. And Paul says, excuse the bad grammar, God don't make no junk. This is good stuff. And Jesus Christ came in the flesh. Several times flesh is used in connection with the desires. And those are good. But most of the time, when flesh is used in connection with desire, it's not good. The fleshly desires. That is, the desires in control. I'm living for the satisfaction of my desires. That's not good. But beyond those 3, we get to the really serious ones. The flesh, and it's the way he's talking about it here. The flesh is my ability to satisfy my desires however I wish. So he says, you can have confidence in your flesh, and you can think that you are spiritually right because of what you're doing in your strength, in your achievement. And churches, pastors are filled with people who are sure that they're going to heaven on the basis of their flesh. on the basis of their own accomplishments, their own attainments, their own achievements. So these Jewish Christians, and now we talked about it yesterday, now the conflict is becoming more severe. Paul's been saying now for 10 or 12 years, no, you do not walk out the life of God in your effort. You cannot do that. But these Jewish Christians are insisting, no, it is your achievements, your knowledge of the Bible, your time spent in prayer, your time spent in circumcision, in Sabbath keeping. That's what really makes you acceptable to God. Yes, you got to believe in Jesus. But unless you're doing all these other things, you really don't believe in Jesus. And Paul is saying, no, beware of them. And he's using pretty strong language. They are dogs. Now, in the Bible, a dog is not a nice animal. They didn't keep pets in those days. They couldn't. Now, some of the rich Romans, the rich Greeks, they could, but the mass of people, they had no money to spend on a pet. They're trying to find enough food for their own bodies. They don't have any to give to a pet. So the dogs are the ones who live on the edges of society, eating garbage, eating a baby that is left unattended for a moment. And that's the picture. There are dogs out there waiting to devour Christian babies. They're evil workers, Paul says. They are mutilators. Yeah, you can see the conflict is becoming really sharp now. Circumcision? No, that's mutilation. We are the circumcision, he says later on. Those of us who've gotten the point of the object lesson. Don't keep hammering the object lesson and forgetting the object. Forgetting the lesson. So, are you acceptable to God because you've spent 10 days at Indian Springs? And those other people in your church, they're back there going to the lake. That's the flesh, folks. That's the flesh. Now, translators struggle with this. And so you get in the NIV oftentimes when you're down at this bottom level where you're talking about the flesh as an attitude of self-dependency. Oftentimes the NIV will translate that the sinful nature. And that's okay. But I think you ought to understand what's behind that. The flesh is behind that. My strength, my desires, my feelings, my wishes, serving God in my strength for my ultimate salvation. That's the flesh. And Paul says, if you have confidence in the flesh, you're dead. The flesh, he says, is going to die. And if you live in the flesh, it'll take you with it. Paul says, if we're going to go that direction, I could have more confidence in the flesh than anybody. I like how honest Paul is. You know, many times we live in this kind of false modesty. Oh, well, I haven't achieved anything. Oh, well, I. And that's not Paul. Paul has been freed from that. Paul says, you want to see a list of credentials? Oh, man, look at this. And he goes down through it there. But he says, I made a great discovery. We're at number 6 now. I made a great discovery. He says, I discovered, this is verse 7, I discovered that whatever was gain to me was loss to Christ. And by extension, whatever was loss to me is gain to Christ. Now think about that a minute. Think about that. You know, you make a gain. You make a real achievement. And God says, too bad. Can you imagine that? The little kid is running a race, and he's given it his all, and he comes in first and breaks the tape, and the father says, oh man, I hate that.